I don't remember waking up that night because of a sound. It wasn't one of those moments where the creak of a floorboard or the slam of a door snatched me from sleep. No, I remember waking in that strange, hollow way where consciousness drips back into you like water seeping into cracked stone. The first thing I felt was stillness. Not the calm kind of stillness, but the sort that presses against your ears, where the silence seems thicker than the dark. I could hear my own breath, the weight of the blanket on my chest, the faint ringing in my ears that only comes when the world is otherwise empty. And then a second later, I realized what had disturbed me wasn't noise at all. It was the absence of it. The refrigerator should have been humming. The clock in the hallway should have been ticking. The radiator should have been clinking faintly with its irregular rhythm. But nothing. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, barely visible in the faint wash of moonlight coming through the blinds. It must have been around 3 in the morning, that dead hour where the night feels stretched too far, when your body insists you should be asleep, but your mind wakes like it's been waiting for something. I turned my head. My apartment was small. From my bedroom, I could see down the short hallway into the living room. Nothing moved. The air felt stale, though, as if I had walked into a room long shut up and untouched, where dust clings thick to the curtains. My throat was dry. I thought maybe I just needed water. I pushed back the blanket and let my feet touch the floor. Cold. The board seemed to hold the chill, a bite that made my skin prickle. My steps felt too loud in that silence, each creak carrying longer than it should have. When I reached the living room, I froze. Every chair I owned, 6 dining chairs, the small stool from the kitchen, the padded armchair from the corner, all of them were stacked in a precarious tower in the middle of the room. Perfectly balanced, high, swaying slightly in the draft that should not have been there. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stood in the doorway staring. The chairs reached nearly to the ceiling. Their legs stuck out at angles, like ribs jutting from a skeleton. The shadow of the tower stretched across the floor, breaking over the rug like a jagged scar. I knew I hadn't done this. I lived alone. No one had a key. I hadn't invited anyone inside for weeks. Yet here they were, every seat I owned, taken from where they belonged and placed here, stacked into a monument of wrongness in the middle of the night. The air smelled different, too. Not just stale, it carried a faint, acrid tang, like burnt hair or overheated wires. My skin prickled. I wanted to reach out, to knock the whole thing over, to scatter the chairs and break the spell of what I was seeing. But I couldn't. My arms hung at my sides, heavy as stone. There was a feeling deep in my gut that if I touched it, if I interfered, it would acknowledge me. Whatever had done this would know I had seen its work. So I stood there. Minutes stretched. The moonlight shifted across the wall. The stack never moved, though I swore I could hear the faintest groan of wood straining against weight. Finally, I backed away, slowly, step by step, until I was in my room again. I closed the door but didn't lock it. Somehow, locking it felt useless. If something could enter without sound, rearrange furniture without waking me, a lock was nothing. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my neck. My heart beat, so hard it shook the mattress. I tried to close my eyes, but behind them I saw the outline of that tower, chairs upon chairs, waiting for me to acknowledge it. When morning came, I expected the tower to be gone. To my horror, it wasn't. The chairs were still stacked neatly in the middle of the room, though daylight stripped them of their menace. In the sun, they looked absurd, childish almost, like a prank. But I had no one in my life to pull pranks, and I knew deep in my marrow that it hadn't been done by human hands. I took the chairs down one by one. My hands trembled as I touched them, expecting each to resist, to fight against me. But they didn't. They were only wood and fabric, heavy in the ordinary way. When the last chair was returned to its place, I stood in the empty space in the center of the room and stared at it. For the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself I had done it. Sleepwalking, maybe, or some strange lapse of memory. But the explanation never settled. It hovered just out of reach, flimsy and unsatisfying. That night, I stayed awake. I sat on the couch, staring at the space in the middle of the room, daring it to change. Hours passed. Midnight. 1. 2. At some point, exhaustion overtook me. My eyes slipped closed. I woke again, not in my bed, but still on the couch. The air was heavy. The silence was back, suffocating. And when I looked to the center of the room, my stomach dropped. The chairs were stacked again. Not in a tower this time. No, they were arranged in a circle, each seat facing inward, like an audience waiting for me to step into the middle. The stool was in the very center, perfectly placed, as if inviting me to sit. I could smell the acrid tang again, stronger now. And beneath it, a damp odor like wet earth, clinging to the floorboards. My skin crawled. Every instinct screamed not to step into that circle. I backed away, never turning, retreating into my room once more. That was weeks ago. Since then, the chairs have moved every night, sometimes stacked, sometimes lined along the walls like sentries. Once, they were arranged in a spiral, curling inward. Every morning, I put them back, and every night, they change again. I don't know why. I don't know what it wants. But last night was different. I woke at the same hour. The silence pressed against me, and when I looked into the living room, the chairs were stacked once more, but not in the center. They were stacked at the foot of my bed, and I swear, in the dark, I saw the faintest outline of a figure perched at the top, its head bent low, watching me breathe. I have always locked my bedroom door before going to bed. It was more than just a habit. It was a ritual. That small metallic click of the lock sliding into place gave me a sense of finality at the end of each day. No matter how chaotic the world outside was, I believed that within those four walls, behind that door, I was safe. The latch wasn't just about security. It was about control, the fragile illusion that when I turned that key, I held back everything that lingered beyond. The first time I found the door open, I thought I had simply forgotten. Sleepy mistakes happen. Maybe I had turned the knob and convinced myself I had locked it. The memory could have blurred in that foggy space between exhaustion and unconsciousness. But when I woke that morning, the door stood wide open, yawning into the dark hallway beyond. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I knew I had locked it. I could recall the way my fingers felt pressing down on the key, the soft scraping sound of metal against metal, the precise satisfaction of turning it. But there it was, open. The hallway outside looked darker than usual. Even with daylight leaking faintly from the living room window, it seemed to resist illumination, as if the shadows had weight. My first instinct was to peer into the corners to listen. The house was still, so still that I could hear the faint ringing in my own ears. I convinced myself it must have been faulty hardware. A door, after all, is just wood, hinges, and a lock. Things slip. Things give way. But the second night, I made sure. I stood there longer than usual, hand wrapped tightly around the knob, testing it, pulling it forward and backward until I was absolutely certain it wouldn't budge. The lock clicked firm. I even pressed my weight against the wood, feeling it hold. Only then did I allow myself to lie down. Sleep didn't come easily. I drifted in and out, surfacing in the dark, every little sound in the house amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint groan of wood expanding in the night, the pulse of my own heartbeat pressing against the pillow. When the gray light of morning slid across my room, I opened my eyes, and the door was open again. This time it wasn't just slightly ajar. It was wide, an almost deliberate stretch of openness, as if to say, "Look, see what was allowed in." Cold air spilled into the room. The hallway looked like a gaping throat leading into somewhere endless. My skin prickled, my mouth dry. That was when a different kind of fear took hold. Not the simple fear of forgetting, but the fear of intrusion. I searched the house. Every window was locked, every door latched from the inside. Nothing had been moved. Nothing was out of place. Yet something had changed. The air felt touched. It's hard to describe. It was as if the atmosphere had memory, like it had recorded movement I hadn't seen. There was the faintest smell, too. A smell not of anything I kept in the house. It was damp, metallic, faintly earthy. Like soil pressed between wet stones, the smell of something that didn't belong. The nights that followed blurred into a cycle of anticipation and dread. Each evening I locked the door with deliberate precision, and each morning I woke to it standing open. Always wide, never subtle. I stopped sleeping properly. My dreams were fractured, full of shifting walls and endless corridors. Sometimes I thought I felt the weight of footsteps pressing into the floorboards, a heaviness that traveled up into my mattress and through my body. At times, I could swear I woke to the feeling of air moving across my face, not from a draft, but from something passing too close. One night, I tried staying awake. I thought maybe if I caught it in the act, I would know, whether it was my own mistake or something else entirely. I sat up in bed, the room dark but for the thin line of streetlight slipping through the blinds. I watched the door, my body tense, every muscle wired. Hours passed. The clock on my nightstand shifted from numbers to numbers, yet my eyes never left the frame of that door. My lids grew heavy, but I resisted. And then, without sound, without any indication of movement, I realized the lock had disengaged. I didn't hear it click. I didn't see the knob turn. It was simply that one moment it was locked, and the next it wasn't. The door eased forward so quietly, as though it wasn't wood on hinges, but something organic, alive, inhaling. My breath stopped. My chest ached from holding it. I couldn't see anything beyond, but the darkness in the hallway looked deeper than the room itself, thick and swollen. I wanted to reach for a light, but I couldn't move. I was pinned by fear, frozen in that moment of silent intrusion. I kept waiting for a shape to emerge, for footsteps, for proof. But nothing entered. The door only remained open, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I felt hollow. My body ached with exhaustion, but worse was the sinking certainty that I wasn't imagining this. It wasn't broken hardware. It wasn't my own forgetfulness. Something wanted the door open. Something was opening it. After that, the house changed. Shadows seemed to linger longer in corners. The smell returned, damp, metallic, and sharper now, like rusting iron left in the rain. Sometimes I thought I heard faint rustling sounds in the hallway at night, like fabric brushing against the wall, or nails dragging gently over the wood floor. When I turned on the lights, there was nothing. It became a ritual of dread. Lock the door. Lie in bed. Listen. Wake to the open door. Over and over again. The silence of the house grew louder than any noise could have been. It wasn't empty silence. It was watchful, heavy, filled with the awareness of something just outside my reach. I began avoiding mirrors at night. More than once, I caught myself glancing at the one across from my bed when the door was open, and for a second, I thought I saw movement in its reflection. Something passing in the hall, not solid, but enough to ripple the darkness. I told myself not to look again, but of course I always did. One night, as I lay there listening, I felt the mattress dip. It was subtle at first, like the fabric adjusting under my weight, but then it pressed deeper, in a spot where my body wasn't. The weight of it sank slowly, as though someone had lowered themselves carefully onto the edge. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. My hands gripped the blanket, so tightly that my nails broke skin. I lay there, every nerve in my body alive, feeling that presence, that pressure. And then, just as silently, it lifted. When I found the door open again that morning, I realized something horrifying. The lock wasn't just being undone. The door wasn't just being opened. It was being opened from inside. Now, every night feels like a ritual in reverse. I still lock the door, though I know it won't matter. I still check the windows, though they are never touched. I still search for proof, though I know it will leave none. The door will be open in the morning, as it always is. Wide, deliberate, patient. And sometimes, when I wake in the deepest part of the night, before the morning light can wash anything away, I swear I see it. A shape, not defined, not solid, but heavy. Leaning, waiting, just past the threshold. Not coming in. Not yet, but always watching. It's strange, the things we take for granted inside our homes. The way furniture rests in place as though it has grown roots. The way photographs hang on walls to quietly remind us of moments frozen in time. They are fixtures, silent background pieces, never expected to move, never expected to betray the living with even the smallest shift. That was why, when it finally happened, the effect was so violently wrong. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It didn't even feel like it belonged to anyone alive. I should start with the way the air in the house had been feeling for weeks before we noticed the frames. Heavier. Still, but not calm. Still in the way a room feels when you realize you aren't alone. At first, I brushed it off. Old house, creaking wood, drafts slipping under the doors. But the silence was thick, more than just an absence of noise. It was a presence, as if the air itself was pressing in on me, forcing me to notice how empty the rooms were and how wrong that emptiness felt. We lived surrounded by pictures. Family portraits from years ago, school photographs tucked into frames, candid shots from birthdays and summer trips, even faded black and whites of relatives I'd never met. They lined the hallway walls, sat on mantels, perched on shelves. 100 small, frozen smiles that watched us pass each day. They were familiar, comforting, anchors of memory, proof that we were here, that we were real. Until one morning, when they weren't. I woke to a light in the room that felt dimmer than usual. The curtains were drawn as always, yet the gray seemed deeper, as if the daylight had been strained before reaching me. I moved through the house barefoot, and I noticed it before I consciously saw it. A subtle emptiness, as though the walls themselves had gone blind. When I stepped into the hallway, the first thing I saw was a frame on the floor, lying flat against the carpet. It wasn't broken, not even scratched, just face down. That should have been the end of it. Maybe it had slipped from the nail, maybe gravity had done its work. But then my eyes traveled further, down the length of the hall. Every single frame, one after the other, hung crooked, no longer revealing the faces I had seen 1,000 times. They weren't shattered, they weren't damaged. They had all been turned carefully, deliberately, their faces pressed to the wall or laid gently face down against tables and shelves. The hallway felt longer than usual as I walked through it. Each step was muffled by carpet, but I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, the faint rush of blood that drowned out the morning's silence. The air smelled stale, like dust stirred up in an attic, though I hadn't moved anything. I touched one of the frames as I passed, feeling the cool glass, and righted it back up. For a split second, the face staring back at me, my own, smiling awkwardly at some long-forgotten birthday, looked unfamiliar. When I reached the living room, the sight stole the breath from my lungs. Every single picture in the house, every one was turned away. On the fireplace mantel, the shelves, the coffee table, even the small frame on the piano. Not a single face looked back. The house was emptied of us, stripped of its history, as though someone had walked through in the night and erased all evidence that we had ever lived here. But nothing else was touched. Not a drawer opened, not a chair moved. Just the photographs. I remember standing in the middle of the living room, unable to move for several minutes. There was no noise, no hum of the refrigerator, no ticking of the clock. Only the faintest sound of wood settling, though it felt too precise, too rhythmic, as though the house itself was breathing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed felt alien, the darkness too complete. I stared into it, straining for any sign of motion, listening to every small sound. At some point, I must have drifted into something half like sleep, half like waiting. My body was heavy, but my mind was awake when I heard it. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible, the soft scrape of glass against wood, like the sound of a frame being adjusted. I didn't move. My body was locked, pinned down by fear heavier than sleep. But I listened. Another faint scrape, then silence. Then another closer. Always the sound of something small being touched, shifted, turned. When morning came, I moved through the house with dread pooling in my stomach. And it was the same. Every frame I had righted the day before had been turned again. Face down, pressed against the furniture, their smiles hidden once more. It wasn't random. It was careful, gentle even. Whoever, or whatever, did it hadn't wanted to destroy. It wanted to hide. As the days passed, it became a ritual. Each morning, the house greeted us with silence and blank spaces where memories should have been. Each evening, I tried to set them right, only to hear the faint movements in the night and find them all turned away by morning. At first, I tried to fight it. Then I stopped touching them. I let them stay as they were, faces buried, as though that was how they had always been. But the house seemed hungrier after that. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. Shadows clung to corners too tightly, and every reflection in the windows seemed slightly delayed, as though my own image lingered longer than my movement. The worst part wasn't the pictures themselves. It was the feeling that the faces inside them didn't want to be seen. That somehow, those frozen smiles had grown tired of being watched, tired of being reminders of life. That they had turned away not because something forced them to, but because they wanted to. One night, unable to sleep, I stood in the hallway with only the faint glow of moonlight through the window. The walls were lined with frames, all turned inward, their backs exposed. The silence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. And then, faintly, I smelled something I hadn't noticed before. Not dust, not old wood, but something sharper. The scent of old photographs when they've been shut away for years, when the chemicals and paper rot together in darkness. That dry, bitter smell of memory dying. I can't tell you when it became unbearable, only that at some point the house wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't ours. The faces were gone, the walls stripped bare, and in their absence, the rooms grew hollow. The house wasn't filled with us, it was filled with something else. Something that didn't want to be seen, didn't want to share the walls with our frozen smiles. And sometimes late at night, when the silence is deepest, I catch myself wondering if those faces, our faces, were hiding from something. Not from us, but from whatever else was moving quietly through the halls, something careful and patient, that only shows itself when it knows the pictures are no longer watching. Now, the frames remain where they are, all of them face down. I don't touch them anymore. I don't dare to, because I've started to feel it too, the urge to turn away, to hide my face, to let the house sink me into its silence. And I know if I let it, one morning I'll wake up not in my bed, not on the floor, but inside the wall, pressed behind glass, a frozen smile turned down against the darkness. I used to think that houses only came alive in storms, that the creaks, groans, and hollow knocks of wood were nothing but the old bones of a building shifting under the pressure of wind and rain. But sometimes a house breathes in silence, and when it exhales, it does so in the kind of hush that makes you feel watched. The night it started, there was no storm. The air outside was still, thick even, the way it feels just before a summer morning fog spreads across the neighborhood. I remember lying in bed, the small fan buzzing against the wall, pushing warm air in a lazy rotation. The shadows in my room stretched long, under the faint glow of the streetlight pressing in through the blinds. Nothing about that night should have been different from the countless others I had spent in that house. And yet, something felt wrong. It was just after midnight when I first heard it. A low scrape, the muffled grind of wood against wood. At first, I thought it was the house shifting, the old frame giving way with its usual complaints. But it came again, slower this time, and too deliberate to be random. It was the unmistakable sound of a drawer being tugged open. The sound came from down the hall, my mother's room, or maybe the small office next to it. I froze, staring at the ceiling fan blades turning lazily above me. My skin prickled as if I had been dunked into cold water, though the air was hot and unmoving. The scrape continued, followed by the hollow thud of wood stopping against its frame. Then silence. I told myself I was imagining it, that I had been drifting in and out of sleep, my brain weaving sounds from half-dreams into something familiar. But then it came again, this time closer, a sharper drag, as though a drawer had been pulled too quickly, its contents shifting inside. I could almost picture it, the sudden tilt of utensils in the kitchen, or the jumble of folded shirts in my dresser. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. My room felt heavier with every passing second, the air pressing against me. My ears strained for any other noise, but the house fell back into silence. No footsteps, no shifting floorboards, just silence. I must have lain awake for hours, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling, waiting for it to happen again. But it didn't. Not until the morning light crept in through the blinds did I finally let myself drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When I woke, it was almost dawn. The air outside glowed pale blue, the trees motionless in the distance. I rolled out of bed and shuffled toward the hallway, still half asleep, still convincing myself that what I had heard was a dream. But the moment I stepped into the office, my stomach dropped. Every drawer had been pulled out. Not just one or two, but all of them. The filing cabinet drawers hung forward, half empty, their folders spilling onto the carpet. The small desk drawers were yanked all the way out, the contents, pens, loose paper clips, unopened envelopes, scattered like debris after some invisible storm. Even the bottom drawer, the one that always stuck so badly it needed to be pulled with both hands, gaped wide open. It didn't look like someone had been searching for something. It looked staged, deliberate. Every drawer, every compartment, pulled to the exact same degree, as if measured by some unseen hand. I stood there, paralyzed, the smell of paper and old dust heavy in my nose. The silence of the house seemed to press against my ears, almost humming. And in that stillness, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I had locked the office door the night before. I remembered because my mother always told me to keep it locked. It wasn't because of anything supernatural. She just didn't like the idea of me snooping through her work files. I had closed it when I went to bed. The memory was clear. Yet the door was wide open now, swinging slightly as if someone had walked through only moments ago. I stepped back, my bare feet cold against the wood floor, and retreated to my room without touching anything. I closed the door, pressed my back against it, and listened. The drawers didn't move again. The house didn't stir. That was the first night. It didn't stop there. The following nights bled into each other, each one bringing the same haunting rhythm. Just after midnight, always around the same hour, the scraping would begin. Sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, always deliberate. I would lie awake, my eyes wide, trying to tell myself it was a dream. But every morning, I would find something shifted. The kitchen drawers yanked out, silverware scattered in neat, unnatural arcs on the counter. My dresser drawers open, clothes folded, but arranged in a way I never placed them. Even the bathroom drawers, Q-tips aligned in rows, bottles of toothpaste balanced upright along the sink. None of it was random. It was all too careful, too intentional, as if whatever was moving them wanted me to see its work. The worst part wasn't the drawers themselves. It was the silence in between. The way the house would hold its breath after the noise stopped. The way I could feel eyes on me even in the stillness. Some nights, I swore I could hear the faint scrape of fingernails dragging across wood just outside my door. Not a knock, not scratching, more like a patient caress. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating much. My eyes burned from being awake, and my body felt hollow. By the fifth night, I started to wonder if the thing wasn't moving the drawers at all, but pulling something else open, something I couldn't see. Something inside me. The seventh night, I broke. I left my bedroom door cracked, determined to watch, to finally see. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart thudding so loud I thought it might give me away. The hallway stretched into darkness, the office door at the far end a faint outline against the dim light of the window. It started the same way, soft, deliberate scraping, the sound of wood pulling free from wood. But this time, I saw movement. The office door eased open, slow as breath, though no one touched it. The shadows seemed thicker inside, pressing outward, and one by one, the drawers slid open. I couldn't see hands. I couldn't see a figure, but I could hear the faint rattle of objects shifting, papers sighing against each other, pens rolling. My whole body locked in place as I watched the office become dismantled piece by something I could not name. And then, as if sensing me, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything else. The office remained still, but I couldn't shake the certainty that something had turned its attention toward me. The air felt tighter, pressing against my chest, and the faint creak of the floorboard outside my door whispered like a warning. I closed the door. I didn't breathe. I waited until dawn. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, the office wasn't just in disarray. Every drawer in the house was pulled out. My room, the kitchen, the bathroom, every single one. It looked like the house itself had been hollowed out overnight, its inside spilling forward. The smell of dust and wood filled the air, sharp and choking. The sunlight coming in through the windows caught on the edges of open drawers, throwing strange, angular shadows along the walls. It was like walking through a body that had been opened too wide, its secrets displayed for all to see. I don't know why it chose drawers. I don't know why it needed me to hear. All I know is that every night I stayed in that house after, it happened again. Always the scraping, always the pulling, always the silence afterward. I swore I heard drawers opening, and at dawn, I always found them waiting. And I know, somewhere, somehow, they were never empty. I've always believed there are certain objects that absorb more of us than we realize. Some things we carry or wear every day seem to drink in our essence, becoming more than mere possessions. My wedding ring was one of those things. It wasn't just a piece of gold. It was a marker of promises made, of years shared, of every silent glance and every night spent in the comfort of someone's presence. That's why what happened in our house still makes me sick when I think about it. The first time I noticed it, the change was so small I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I had taken my ring off before bed, as I always did, and placed it on the little porcelain dish by the lamp on my nightstand. The room had smelled faintly of the lavender spray my wife had misted on the pillows, mixing with the old, dry scent of the wood dresser. The lampshade threw its weak yellow light in a soft cone across the nightstand, and I remember looking at the rings side by side, hers and mine, glinting faintly like two small eyes watching us drift to sleep. But in the morning, they weren't side by side anymore. Hers was still in the dish, exactly where she had left it. Mine was resting just a few inches away, not in the dish at all, but on the wood surface of the nightstand. The indentation in the dust of the dish where it had sat was empty, stark, as though something had carefully plucked it up and set it down just outside the edge. It wasn't far, just a small move, barely anything. I told myself maybe I had knocked it in my sleep, though the dish never rattled, never moved from its place. I forced myself to believe that. Objects shift. People bump things without noticing. It happens. But the next morning it happened again. This time, both rings were outside of the dish. Hers lay on the nightstand, and mine was on the floor beneath it, half resting against the base of the lamp cord. I remember crouching down to pick it up, my fingertips brushing against the cold wooden floorboards. The faint dust collected under the nightstand smeared against the gold as I lifted it. The strangest part wasn't just where it was, but how it had been placed, balanced upright, resting against the cord, not flat, not fallen. Balanced. As if someone had set it that way deliberately. I didn't tell her that morning. I didn't want to. The sunlight was just creeping through the blinds, thin beams striping the bed and catching against the pale fabric of the sheets. She was still in that heavy, drowsy state between waking and sleeping, and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen made the house feel normal, alive. I didn't want to spoil that, but the nights kept undoing what the days tried to fix. By the end of that week, the rings weren't just moving across the nightstand. They were moving farther. I found them one morning at the edge of the dresser across the room, laid side by side again, though we hadn't put them there. Another time, hers was still in the dish, but mine was balanced precariously on the lip of the lampshade, catching the morning sun in a blinding gleam. I had to climb on the chair to reach it. The sense of intrusion grew heavier each day. The bedroom always carried a faint, musty sweetness at night, the smell of old carpet mixed with whatever detergent lingered from the sheets. But now that smell began to feel wrong. Heavier, almost metallic at times, like the air inside the room was tinged with something sharp. I began waking at odd hours, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I'd open my eyes to the faint glow of the alarm clock and feel it, an awareness that the room was not empty, that the rings weren't the only things shifting in the dark. Then it spread beyond the bedroom. One morning, the dish on the nightstand was empty entirely. Both our rings were gone. Panic shot through me. I tore the sheets back, checked beneath the pillows, scanned the carpet with frantic hands, my breath turning ragged in the early light. It wasn't until I stumbled out into the hallway that I saw them. They were in the kitchen, placed carefully in the middle of the table. Not tossed, not dropped, but placed side by side again, as if someone had carried them there with reverence. The cold of the rings seeped into my fingertips when I picked them up, though the kitchen was warm with the faint smell of bread from the night before. I couldn't stop shaking as I carried them back upstairs. I told her that time. I had to, but I could see in her face she didn't want to believe it. She smiled with that forced calm that doesn't reach the eyes, and said maybe I had taken them off myself and forgotten. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. It didn't stop. The nights became suffocating. The creak of the old house grew sharper, like footsteps dragging just beyond the hallway. The air seemed to grow colder near the dresser, near the nightstand. I began to notice the faintest sounds, the soft scrape of metal on wood, the whisper of something shifting on the floor. Sometimes I'd wake with my chest tight, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on me. And always, in the morning, the rings were somewhere else. The bathroom sink, the edge of the banister on the stairs. Once, balanced neatly on the cold tiles by the front door, as if waiting for us to pick them up before leaving. It was never random, never careless, always deliberate, always precise. The worst night was the night I woke to the sound of metal clinking. It was faint but sharp in the silence, a sound that didn't belong. I opened my eyes to the pale wash of moonlight through the curtains. The room smelled different, stale, almost damp, like the air of a cellar. I turned my head toward the nightstand. The dish was empty. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't stop myself. I sat up, listening. The clink came again, this time from the dresser. Slowly, I slid out of bed, my bare feet sinking into the cold carpet. The darkness seemed to thicken around me as I crossed the room. The rings weren't on the dresser. They were on the floor in front of it, standing upright, leaning against each other like two figures propping one another up. They shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and I felt a sick pull in my stomach, a certainty that I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. I bent down to pick them up, but just before my fingers touched the metal, the air shifted. It felt like someone exhaled directly against my neck. Cold, damp, heavy. I snatched the rings and stumbled back into bed, clutching them so hard into my palm that they left red imprints in my skin. We stopped leaving them on the nightstand after that. We started keeping them in a drawer, hidden tucked away. It didn't matter. The next morning, the drawer was open, and the rings were resting neatly on the windowsill, side by side, glinting in the early gray light. No matter where we put them, they moved. There's no comfort in routine anymore, no safety in the familiar. Every night carries the weight of anticipation, the dread of where we'll find them next. I lie awake listening to the old house breathe and creak, staring at the faint silhouette of furniture in the darkness, waiting for the metallic scrape, the small, deliberate sound of something being moved. The rings were meant to be a symbol of permanence, of grounding, of promises carved into gold. Now they feel like a message written in silence and left for us to discover each morning. A message we were never meant to understand. And still, even now, I know as I close my eyes tonight, they will not be where I left them in the morning. They never are. I never liked being left alone in that room. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from seeing shadows dart across the walls or hearing whispers in the dark. It was subtler than that, quieter. The kind of fear that builds when everything seems still, yet your body insists that something unseen is moving around you. The room had a smell I couldn't ever forget. Not the kind of mustiness you expect in a child's bedroom, but something faintly metallic, like the tang of cold pennies pressed against your tongue. It clung to the carpet, to the wood of the dresser, to the very fabric of the curtains. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the smell of old heating pipes or the varnish that had been used on the furniture, but deep down I knew it was something else. The room was filled with toys, not a cluttered mess, but neat arranged. Shelves lined with little plastic figures, cars that gleamed dully under the weak light of a single lamp, stuffed animals sitting stiffly on the dresser. They all had faces, eyes that seemed to follow me when I moved around. During the day, they were harmless enough. I could pretend they were just objects. But at night, when the lamp went off and the air cooled, they seemed to breathe in the darkness. The first time it happened, I didn't even notice. I woke in the gray haze of early morning and stretched, pulling the blanket higher against the chill that seeped from the walls. My eyes drifted across the carpet, still heavy with sleep, and I thought nothing of the toys spread across the floor. It was only after a few long minutes that my mind caught up with what I was seeing. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged. A circle. Perfect, deliberate, precise. Every toy car, every action figure, every block and stuffed animal, each one positioned edge to edge in a ring around the center of the room. The circle was flawless, almost mathematical, as though drawn with a compass. My heart gave a slow, uneasy thud. I didn't remember doing that. I didn't remember touching them at all. The night before, I had left them where they were. Half a tower of blocks crumbled beside my bed. A few cars pushed under the dresser, a stuffed bear slumped in the corner. Now they were all here, unified, symmetrical. I wanted to believe I had done it myself, maybe while half asleep, maybe in some childish trance. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. But even then, a small part of me knew better. The days that followed blurred into one another, but the circle returned each morning. Always perfect, always precise. Some nights I tried to stay awake, straining my eyes in the darkness, listening to the stillness of the house. But exhaustion always won. My eyelids grew heavy, and no matter how hard I fought it, sleep dragged me under. When I woke, the circle was there again, silent and accusing, as if it had been waiting for me to open my eyes. The detail unsettled me the most. The toys weren't just placed in a ring. They were positioned in a hierarchy. Larger toys formed the outer rim, smaller ones nestled inside, each figure facing inward. Stuffed animals sat upright as though watching the empty center. Cars pointed toward it, wheels lined perfectly. There was no break in the chain, no uneven spacing. Even the tiniest block was aligned. I stopped touching them. I couldn't bring myself to break the circle once it appeared. Something about it felt untouchable, sacred in a twisted way. I stepped around it, careful not to disturb its edges, as though crossing the invisible boundary might bring something down upon me. The smell grew stronger, that metallic tang. Some mornings it was so sharp it made my stomach twist. I checked the vents, the windows, the closet. Nothing. The air seemed to grow heavier too, as though the walls themselves pressed closer each night. There were sounds as well. Not loud, not enough to rouse anyone else in the house. But I heard them, faint as a whisper. The shuffle of plastic on carpet. The muted creak of something shifting weight. Sometimes it came just as I was drifting off, so subtle I thought it might be part of my dream. But then I'd jolt awake, heart racing, and the room would be silent again. I stopped sleeping properly. My dreams, when I had them, were filled with circles, rings of light, rings of shadow, rings of eyes staring from the dark. Always watching, always waiting, One night, I dared to leave a toy outside the room. A single stuffed rabbit I placed carefully on the hallway floor before bed. I wanted to test it, to see if the circle would still form without it. Morning came, and when I opened my eyes, the rabbit was there. Inside the circle, sitting upright with the others, its glassy eyes turned toward the center. I never heard the door open. I never heard it dragged across the floor. But it was there, placed with impossible care. By then, I had stopped telling myself it was me. The precision was too perfect, the intent too strong. It wasn't random. It wasn't unconscious. Something wanted that circle formed, and it wanted me to see it. The center remained empty at first. Always vacant, always clean, as though waiting for something to occupy it. But one morning, I woke to find an object lying there. Not a toy, not anything that belonged to me. A small coin, old and tarnished, its surface worn smooth by age. It smelled like the room, metallic, sharp, almost coppery. Another morning, it was a nail. Bent, rusted, jagged. Then a marble. Then a fragment of glass. Each day, something new, always in the center of the circle. Always waiting. I stopped going into the room willingly. I lingered in doorways, hesitated at the threshold, my stomach knotted tight. But no matter how much I resisted, I always ended up back inside. Night drew me there. Sleep pinned me down. And every morning, the circle greeted me more elaborate, more deliberate. The toys weren't just in a circle anymore. They began forming patterns within patterns, spirals, lines, intersecting arcs. It was geometry too complex for me to fully understand, yet so precise it couldn't have been random. The objects in the center grew stranger as well. A dead moth with its wings pinned open. A scrap of burned paper. A single tooth, small and yellowed. The smell was unbearable now. The air thick with copper, with dust, with something that hinted at decay. I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? What words could I use that wouldn't sound insane? I began to keep the door locked at night, but it didn't matter. Each morning, the lock was undone, and the circle waited for me, perfect as ever. The last night I remember clearly was the one I tried to fight back. I gathered every toy, shoved them into the closet, stacked heavy boxes in front of the door. I wanted to see if it would stop, if the circle would finally break. I lay awake for hours, every muscle tense, every sound magnified in the silence. Somewhere past midnight, I heard it. Not faint this time, not distant. The scrape of wood against carpet. The muffled drag of something heavy moving inch by inch. I buried my head beneath the covers, trembling, the air hot and suffocating. When sleep finally claimed me, it was merciful. But when morning came, and light seeped through the curtains, I wished I had never opened my eyes again. The toys were there. Every single one, pulled from the closet, arranged in the most elaborate circle yet. Concentric rings within rings, layers spiraling inward like the coils of some enormous serpent. And in the center, resting perfectly, was my blanket, folded neatly as though placed with reverence. I don't remember much after that. Just the weight of my own heartbeat in my ears, the taste of metal on my tongue, and the realization that no matter how many times I left that room, it would never let me go. The toys had stopped being mine long ago. They weren't playthings anymore. They were tools, arranged with purpose, arranged for something I was never meant to understand. And each morning as I opened my eyes, I knew they were waiting, patient, silent, forming their perfect circle again and again. Travel has always carried with it a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Airports, with their endless sterile corridors and the constant murmur of unseen announcements echoing through tiled walls, already have a way of making me feel slightly detached from myself. By the time I arrived in the city that evening, late, too late, after a delayed flight and a headache from recycled air and cramped seats, I was already worn thin. The cab ride from the airport blurred into a haze of sodium lamps and reflections on wet asphalt. Rain had come through earlier, leaving the streets damp and shining, and every red light scattered itself into streaks on the glass. By the time the car pulled up to the hotel, I had already begun to crave silence, the muted comfort of a locked door, and the ritual of unpacking, just enough to convince myself I wasn't a stranger. The hotel was the kind of place that wasn't old enough to be charming, but not new enough to be bright. Its carpets dulled into grays where hundreds of shoes had traced the same path over years. The lobby carried a faint perfume of disinfectant, layered over by something faintly metallic, like old coins handled too long. I rode the elevator to the 5th floor, listening to the cables hum above me, watching the numbers blink sluggishly in their little square frames. The hallway was long, pale, and silent except for the occasional hum of pipes hidden in the walls. My room, 523, stood exactly where the dim light of a single wall sconce cut off into shadow. I slid the keycard in, waited for the muted click of the lock, and stepped inside. The first impression of the room was how still it felt. Hotel rooms are always in a strange limbo, furnished but lifeless, carefully arranged but entirely impersonal. Beige curtains framed the window, drawn half shut so the glow of the street below leaked in through the seams. The air conditioner hummed softly, moving the heavy air. And there, against the far wall, sat my suitcase. I left it closed, unbothered, while I went to wash the day from my face. The bathroom mirror gave back my reflection in dim light, shadows pooling beneath my eyes. I lingered there longer than usual, letting the sound of running water mask the unfamiliar hush of the room beyond. Eventually, I killed the light and returned, half expecting to feel some sense of relief. Instead, something else, something small and nagging, began its slow creep in the back of my mind. It was only after I lowered myself onto the bed that I noticed it. The suitcase. It wasn't closed anymore. At first, I thought perhaps I had forgotten, though the memory of tugging it into the room, wheels rattling against the threshold, had been so clear. I remember setting it upright, handle still extended, telling myself I'd unpack later. Yet there it was, lying flat on the carpet, lid parted open, clothes spilling from its mouth like something exhaled. The sight carried with it a strange, immediate discomfort. My shirts were folded neatly, neater than I would ever fold them. My socks paired and stacked, my toiletries lined along the desk with clinical precision. The act wasn't random nor hurried. It was deliberate, practiced, almost reverent. I stood still, the muffled hum of the air conditioner suddenly too loud, my heartbeat louder still. The only explanation I could summon was housekeeping. A mistake, perhaps. They'd entered the wrong room, assuming it was still vacant, and in their diligence had begun to unpack. The thought was thin, barely able to hold the weight of what I was seeing. But I clung to it. I forced myself to move. Each step across the carpet felt louder than it should have, as though the floor beneath me was listening. My fingertips brushed the clothes, the perfectly aligned rows, the symmetry of it all. There was an intimacy to it I couldn't ignore. Someone had touched these things, not in passing, but with intention. The smell confirmed it, not the neutral, chemical air of the room, but something faint, human. A trace of skin, of fabric warmed by another hand. The desk lamp flickered once when I turned it on, casting the room into sharp contrast. Every fold of fabric seemed too precise, each edge aligned to the next as if measured. My belt coiled like a snake, watch resting beside it, wallet stacked on top as though waiting for inspection. I could not remember ever arranging my belongings so carefully. I wouldn't have. The longer I stared, the deeper the unease grew. The curtains stirred slightly, though the window behind them was sealed. I felt a draft that shouldn't exist, cool against the back of my neck. My eyes moved to the corners of the room, tracing the spaces where shadows pooled too heavily. Nothing shifted, nothing revealed itself, but I felt, with increasing certainty, that I was not alone. Hours bled together in that heavy silence. I tried to rationalize, to convince myself it was all some mistake. Yet each attempt crumbled under the weight of a more sinister possibility. Whoever had touched my belongings had done so while I was absent, but not necessarily when I was gone. The thought slithered in. What if they had still been here when I returned? The closet door, I realized, stood slightly ajar. I did not remember leaving it that way. Its black seam seemed to pulse against the dim light, inviting, threatening. I couldn't bring myself to open it. The same with the bathroom, door half closed, shadows spilling out. Every possible hiding place became unbearable. The bed no longer felt like a refuge. I sat upright, pulse heavy in my throat, listening for anything beneath the layered hum of the building. For hours, perhaps, I sat like that, eyes fixed on the shapes of my own belongings, now unfamiliar, foreign. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at me, though no comfort came. When morning broke, gray light seeping in through the curtains, the arrangement of my things remained unchanged. Perfect, deliberate. Yet one detail had shifted. My watch, which I had seen resting neatly at the edge of the desk, now lay at the center of the pillow where my head had almost rested. It gleamed there in the morning light, face tilted upward as though waiting. I did not stay another night. I live alone. That fact is important to remember as I tell you this. My little house is tucked away at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, with just enough distance from the nearest neighbors that silence becomes its own kind of companion. At night, the only sounds that usually pass through these thin walls are the hum of the refrigerator, the creaks of the foundation shifting with the cool air, and the occasional scratching of branches against the windows when the wind decides to move them. I've lived here long enough that these small disturbances became comforting, a reminder that even silence carries its own kind of rhythm. It was a small house, old enough that the floorboards groaned under each step, but not so old that it felt decrepit. I had furnished it sparsely. One sofa, a single bed, a desk for work, and in the kitchen, a simple wooden table that had been with me since my first apartment. It was scratched and uneven, one leg slightly shorter than the others, but it had character. That table was where I sat most nights, eating my dinner alone, scrolling on my phone, or simply staring out the window at the dim streetlight that flickered in the distance. And every night, before I went to bed, I always left it the same way. Empty. Bare. Sometimes with a coffee mug sitting in the middle, maybe an empty plate if I hadn't washed up yet, but never more than that. I live alone. No one else eats here. The first morning I noticed it, I almost convinced myself I was still half asleep. I shuffled into the kitchen, the faint blue of early dawn still filtering through the curtains, and stopped dead in my tracks. My table wasn't bare. 2 places had been set. Plates neatly stacked. Silverware aligned as if measured. Glasses polished and catching the faintest glimmer of morning light. It was too deliberate, too precise. The strangest part was that the cutlery wasn't mine. I only owned 4 mismatched forks, 2 chipped knives, and a handful of spoons I'd collected over the years. But the silverware set before me gleamed, as if untouched by use. The plates were pure white porcelain, unfamiliar to me. I stood there, staring, waiting for my brain to fill in the blanks with some logical explanation. I had no guests. I had not purchased anything new, and I never set my table like that, especially not for 2. The air felt wrong, heavy somehow, carrying a faint metallic tang, like the smell of pennies pressed against your skin. The refrigerator hummed steadily behind me, but I could feel the silence pressing in, as though the room were holding its breath. I didn't touch the plates. I didn't move the silverware. I simply backed out of the kitchen, shut the door, and told myself I would deal with it later. When I returned an hour later, after pacing my living room and convincing myself I was overreacting, the table was bare again. Just the familiar scratches, the uneven wood, nothing else. I could have convinced myself it had been a dream, if not for the faint, circular marks left on the table's surface, as if glasses had been placed there and lifted away. The following night, I tried to shake it off. I made tea, read a book until my eyes grew heavy, and crawled into bed without so much as a glance into the kitchen. My sleep was restless, disturbed by half-dreams of clinking silverware and soft movements just beyond the edges of my hearing. I woke several times, staring into the dark, convinced someone had walked past my door. But each time I rose to check, the hallway was empty, the air stale and unmoving. When dawn crept in again, I entered the kitchen with dread already settling in my stomach. And there it was, 2 place settings, identical to the morning before. Perfect, symmetrical, plates, silverware, glasses, the same faint metallic smell lingering in the air. This time, though, something new had been added. A folded napkin, pressed neatly on each plate, as though awaiting a formal dinner. My hands trembled when I reached out to touch the fabric. It was real, smooth, cold against my fingertips, and definitely not mine. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. Instead, I backed away again, my eyes never leaving the table. I had locked every door, checked every window. No one could have entered. No one should have been able to. Yet every morning something, or someone, was preparing a meal for 2 in my house. That night, I did something reckless. I left the table bare again, but placed a small mound of flour on the floor between the kitchen door and the hallway. I don't know what I expected, footprints, maybe, or at least some sign that whatever was happening had a physical presence. I left the lights off, forcing myself into the darkness of my bedroom, and lay awake for hours. Every creak made my body stiffen. Every gust of wind against the window made me clutch the blanket tighter. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke, it was to a chilling stillness. The kitchen door stood half open. My flour trap was untouched, perfectly smooth, as though no one had crossed it. But on the table sat the same 2 place settings, plates, silverware, glasses, and this time food. Not food I had cooked. Not food I recognized. It looked pale, glistening faintly like boiled meat without seasoning. Steam rose from it faintly, curling in the morning light. The napkins had been unfolded and laid beside the plates, as though two invisible figures had just sat down to eat. The smell hit me then. Rotten, damp, the kind of odor that crawls into your nose and sits heavy in your throat. My stomach churned. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, almost suffocating. I stumbled back into the hallway, while rising in my throat, terrified to take another step closer. When I worked up the courage to return later, the plates were empty. The table cleared, but the smell remained, seeping into the walls, clinging to my clothes. Nights blurred together after that. Sleep abandoned me. Each morning, the table was reset, sometimes with food, sometimes just with cutlery. Sometimes the napkins were folded differently, as if mocking me with subtle changes. Once, I found a long, thin scratch running across the wood, as though a knife had been dragged from one end of the table to the other. Another morning, there was a dark, wet ring on the table where something had been spilled and then wiped away, leaving only the faintest trace. The silence of my house no longer felt like solitude. It felt like anticipation. I began to notice the smallest things, the way the refrigerator seemed louder now, how the shadows around the table seemed to linger too long, how the air in the kitchen always felt colder than the rest of the house. I stopped eating in there altogether, choosing instead to take my food into the living room, where I could pretend nothing waited for me in the mornings. But I couldn't escape it. Every morning, two places. Perfect. Waiting. One night, exhaustion won, and I slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke, the morning light was different, sharper somehow, cutting across my bedroom floor in pale stripes. I rose slowly, the dread already gnawing at my stomach, and walked to the kitchen with numb legs. The table was set again, but this time, it wasn't empty plates. On one plate sat a piece of meat, raw and glistening red. On the other, a folded napkin and nothing more, as though my seat had been reserved. The glass on my side was filled with water. Clear. Still. The chair was pulled out, waiting for me.